David Bursey here with a new episode of 3 for All. This is 3 Robert Cray Licks from 1986, and without question, Robert Cray is a blues guitar legend, a great player. Very smooth and dynamic, with lots of energy and feel when he plays. Great guitarist. And he's actually been on the scene a lot longer than most people realize. His career started somewhere around 1974. He was playing clubs and just kind of getting started in those early years. Released his first album in 1980. He actually released 3 albums in the early 80s. In 1985, he recorded an album with Albert Collins and Johnny Copeland called Showdown. That's a classic blues album. You have to hear Showdown. In 1986, he released Strong Persuader, which blew up, and Smoking Gun was a hit. And since then, he's released, 20 studio albums. He's won 5 Grammy Awards. Definitely a legendary guitarist. And this episode's a continuation of the Playing with Feel series that I introduced back in September. And definitely, Robert Cray is a great, feel-based guitarist. And if you're kind of struggling with that, like how to get more energy and tone and sound out of your playing, this episode's totally for you. So far during Robert Cray's career, he's been around the block and worked with a whole bunch of impressive musicians. John Lee Hooker, I mentioned Albert Collins a minute ago. He was part of, Clapton's Crossroads Festival. There's all sorts of players that he's worked with, either on stage or in the studio or behind the scenes. So here's an image with some of the people that Robert Cray's worked with in his career. I actually caught Robert Cray in concert. That was back in 1995 at the Vogue in Indianapolis, Indiana, and he was on his Some Rainy Morning tour. And that was a great show. I remember I wanted to see Robert Cray, and I went. And I remember, it was kind of laid back as far as, because that's kind of a rock club for the most part, but it was laid back. The band sounded great. Robert sounded great. And I remember leaving thinking, wow, he's so smooth, and he made everything he played so effortless, and it just sounded great with this band, and it was tight. Phenomenal concert. And one thing I don't want anybody to forget is Robert Cray actually appears in the classic 1979 film Animal House, John Belushi. And Robert's actually the bassist in the band for Otis Day and the Knights, like in the bar scene when they play Shout and everybody's, singing and jumping around. That famous scene, Robert's actually the bassist in that band, and I didn't know that for a long time, and when I discovered that, I thought, wow, that's Robert Cray, that's so cool. So the licks in this episode came from a live performance in England in 1986. I believe this was televised, over in England. And it definitely catches Robert, on his rise, because Strong Persuader had already came out, and he was, definitely exploding in popularity right at this time. And, the footage is really clean. You can hear him, you can see him, and there's some good footage. And this, like I mentioned earlier, this episode's a continuation of the Playing with Feel series that I introduced back in September. And this is technically the 6th episode. Because so far, we've looked at Blue Saraceno, Michael Schenker, John Sykes, Steve Vai, Chris Duarte, and now Robert Cray. So anyway, here we go. All right, the first lick features some of Robert's strong melodic phrasing, and this whole episode is going to revolve around the key of C minor or C minor 7. And by the end of this episode, you're going to become really good at bending this F to G, up a whole step. We're going to see a lot of that bend in this episode. And this first lick, something like this. One more time. So we're in C minor, and think of, like the C minor pentatonic box right here. But we're in the next position right here. And you're going to see a lot of that action right there out of that little, kind of Albert King box, technically is what that is. That shape right above the box right here. That's the famous Albert King box right there. And we've talked about that box on this channel before. So we're playing right out of Albert's box, and Robert's starting the phrase here. Right? Like this. And the trick there is you're obviously digging in. You're picking hard. You're also, grabbing those notes with some authority. When you do that bend without picking, you're going to release it in that little bit of vibrato like this. and that's tricky. And then, so you're going to do that aggressive bend, 4 times in a row. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then you hear that little pull off from that C to B flat at the end of that phrase. Like that. And then start that phrase again. And then do that same. And he's just kind of, staying on that big, F bend to G. Really digging in right there too. An expressive lick, and definitely very Robert Cray-esque. Up next is a smeared bending phrase, and we're still in the key of C minor, and something like this. One more time. So we're still in C minor. This is out of the box right there. And you hear him grab this B flat, and he kind of smears it, and then slowly, painstakingly bends it up to C. And then you hear him, I'm hearing like a hybrid picked C right there on the high E string. Just that kind of snap. Like that. And I think he's also hybrid picking this. I could be wrong, and that's one thing about Robert's playing style, is he's constantly going from the pick to fingers to hybrid picking. And it's really tricky to kind of, stay basically in link with what he's doing, because he's constantly switching back and forth like that. He might actually be using the pick on that final C, like that. So right there, you're doing that kind of gradual bend, snap that final C right here, and then you're sliding into the flat 5 right there, and I think he's hybrid picking right here, like that. And it's definitely a very common blues lick. Stevie Ray Vaughan used to do that all the time. But he's just kind of sliding in and out of the flat 5. Something like that. Cool lick. Up next is this really slick ringing triad idea from Robert. Something like this. Time. Something like that. So he's basically sliding into this partial, C minor triad. There's your C, G, and E flat right there. And I'm hearing him slide into the bottom part, and then when he catches that top part, he's sustaining the whole triad like that. That's really cool to hear the slide, and then you suddenly hear that whole triad. He's adding vibrato there, and then he starts picking through that triad. And kind of giving it almost like this tremolo or vibrato kind of effect with his hand. That's really expressive, really cool. And then he strums that triad a couple more times. And then once again, he's grabbing F, bending that to G. Bend it once. And then you're going to basically bend that 4 more times. And then you're going to grab E flat. And you're just kind of making your way back down to that C. Like that. Really expressive lick, and I love phrases like that. Here's a bonus lick from this footage, and once again we're bending F up to G. I told you you're going to get really good at that bend. And this is interesting because he starts the phrase with the pick and then ends up hybrid picking, we're using his fingers at the end, like this. One more more time. And right there, we're basically, like I said, bending that F to G. Bend it once, really solid. And then keep that bend held, and then pick it 4 more times, like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, like that. And then you're going to release the bend, and that's when you start hybrid picking. Grab this F, you're going to play with that E flat, and then grab that C, go back to E flat, and you're kind of smearing that E flat at the end. And that definitely has a very different sound than the pick, when you use your fingers like that. It has the snappier, kind of plucky sound. So definitely experiment with using your pick and also using your fingers. That's a great lick. Alright, that's going to wrap this episode of 3 for All with 3 Robert Cray Licks from 1986. And I definitely wanted to add this one to the mix because it is a little different than some of the other players we've looked at. And with Robert, he's using significantly less distortion and overdrive, a much cleaner guitar sound. He's also a master of those glassy Strat tones, because most Strat players, they play, bridge, neck. But then you'll find Robert, in position 3 and position 4 and position 2 and stuff, those glassy, Strat tones. And primarily a clean tone, just a little bit of grit, slight overdrive. And that makes all of his licks and phrasing so much harder, because when you're bending strings with no, just crazy gain and distortion, you really have to grab onto those notes and hold, the bending and the fretted notes that you're holding down. Much different than you do when you're using lots of distortion. Lots of distortion and effects, heck, it's easy because the distortion's kind of doing all the work for you. But with a cleaner sound, it's really hard to get some of these expressive, dynamic sounds out of the guitar, because you really have to dig in and play a little bit more aggressively because you're using significantly less gain. Something to think about. So anyway, leave some feedback and comments. Please subscribe to Lessons, and I'll be back before you know it with more content and material. Thank you.